Yes, my friends, this is not very good news. And man, the Texans will have to address this loss as soon as possible. What initially seemed like a serious injury has now turned into something even more significant. I'm about to tell you everything I've learned. But first, make sure you've already hit the like button. But only do it if you agree with me that EJ Speed is an excellent player and deserves a speedy recovery. If possible, write this: "Get well soon, Speed." So here's the situation. According to the information that has been released and discussed, linebacker EJ Speed is expected to miss the entire 2026 NFL season after doctors determined that his quadriceps injury was a complete rupture following surgery. What many believed could eventually lead to a mid-season return has now turned into a season-ending setback for one of the players the Texans were counting on in their linebacker rotation. This news is especially difficult because there had been optimism regarding Speed's role. The expectation was that he could provide valuable depth to the defense and potentially return later this year. Instead, the updated medical evaluation has completely changed that outlook. After a second assessment of the injury and the surgery itself, doctors reportedly determined that the damage was more severe than initially expected, leading to the conclusion that he would not be cleared to return during the season. For the Texans, this creates an immediate challenge. Speed had re-signed with Houston during the off-season after what was described as a good year with the team. He agreed to a 2-year deal, meaning he remains under contract moving forward. But that does little to help the defense in the short term. The focus now shifts entirely toward how Houston plans to replace the snaps and responsibilities that were expected to belong to him this season. The most important part of this story is not simply that a player suffered an injury. Injuries happen every year across the NFL. The bigger issue is what this means for the structure of the Texans' linebacker room. When Speed was available, there was a clear belief that he could serve as linebacker 3 and potentially step into a larger role whenever needed. That type of flexibility is valuable over a long season. Now, Houston must find those answers elsewhere. As things currently stand, the discussion surrounding the linebacker depth chart has become much more important. Azeez Al-Shaair and Henry To'oTo'o remain the established names at the top of the group, but behind them, the competition becomes far more open. Without Speed available, several players suddenly find themselves in position to compete for a bigger role than originally anticipated. One name that immediately enters the spotlight is Jake Hansen. Based on the discussion surrounding the current roster, Hansen appears to be viewed as an early candidate for the linebacker 3 position. His familiarity with the organization works in his favor. He has been with the team for multiple seasons, and there is a clear indication that the Texans appreciate what he brings because they have continued bringing him back. While much of his reputation has been built through special teams contributions, there is now an opportunity for him to compete for a more significant defensive role. The reasoning behind that possibility is straightforward. Teams often value players they trust. Coaches value reliability. When a player already understands the system and has experience inside the organization, that familiarity can become extremely important when unexpected roster challenges emerge. Hansen may have entered the offseason without a guaranteed path to a larger role, but the circumstances surrounding Speed's injury have undoubtedly changed the equation. At the same time, Hansen is far from the only player who could benefit from this development. Another interesting name mentioned in the conversation is Marte Mapu. Houston acquired Mapu earlier in the offseason through a trade involving a 7th-round pick. There are multiple reasons why that move now looks more significant than it did when it first happened. Mapu's background adds another layer to the story. He was originally selected in the 3rd round by New England, and it was noted that he had a top 30 visit with Houston during the draft process. That detail suggests there has been interest in Mapu from the Texans for quite some time. It was also highlighted that DeMeco Ryans spoke positively about Mapu during OTA practices and expressed appreciation for his game. With Speed no longer available, every practice rep and every preseason opportunity becomes even more important for a player like Mapu. The Texans also have younger players who could now find themselves with a greater opportunity than expected. Wade Woodaz, selected in the 4th round, and Aiden Fisher, selected in the 7th round, were both identified as players worth monitoring moving forward. The significance of this injury extends beyond veterans already on the roster, because it opens a pathway for rookies to earn meaningful playing time. That is often how opportunities are created in the NFL. A roster change forces a coaching staff to reevaluate depth. Players who may have initially been expected to develop at a slower pace suddenly receive chances to prove they are ready immediately. For Woodaz and Fisher, the competition at linebacker becomes much more interesting because there are now additional snaps available and a clear opening behind the established starters. The larger goal remains unchanged. The expectation discussed around the team is that Houston wants to field one of the best defenses in football. The challenge now is ensuring the depth remains strong enough to support that objective throughout the season. Every defense can point to its star players, but depth is often what determines whether a unit can maintain its level of play across an entire year. That is why this injury carries so much weight. It is not solely about losing one player. It is about losing a player who was expected to contribute within a group that now must prove it can withstand adversity. The Texans still have options. They still have competition. They still have players capable of stepping into larger responsibilities. But there is no question that the situation has changed significantly from where it stood before the updated medical diagnosis. Another aspect worth paying attention to is the possibility of Houston exploring outside help. It was specifically mentioned that while the team could choose to look internally first, bringing in another linebacker should not be ruled out. The Texans have already added players through free agency, completed trades, and used draft selections to strengthen the position. Even so, losing speed for the entire season naturally creates speculation about whether another move could eventually occur. For now, however, the spotlight remains on the players already in the building. Every practice, every meeting, and every evaluation period becomes more important because the competition for playing time has intensified. The absence of speed leaves a vacancy that someone must fill, and the battle to determine who earns that opportunity will be one of the most interesting stories to follow moving forward. While the injury news dominated the conversation, there was also another roster move that deserves attention. The Texans reportedly signed former Tulane offensive lineman Derek Graham after a successful workout. The move may not generate the same headlines as a major free agent acquisition, but it provides insight into how Houston continues to evaluate and add talent throughout the offseason. Looking at Graham's recent college production, he played 971 snaps and spent most of his time at left tackle, while also seeing action at right tackle earlier in his college career. The reported grades and statistics showed a player with significant experience, and Houston has now given him an opportunity to compete within the organization. The timing of the move is notable because the Texans had recently moved on from another player and subsequently added Graham to provide additional offensive line depth. It was also pointed out that Houston spent much of the offseason adding interior offensive linemen, while fewer additions were made at tackle. From that perspective, bringing in another tackle candidate makes sense as the team continues building competition across the roster. One of the more interesting details surrounding Graham involves his connection to offensive line coach Cole Popovich. Graham began his college career at Troy, where he played under Popovich. That relationship immediately drew attention because organizational familiarity often plays a role when teams evaluate potential additions. The Texans clearly have prior knowledge of Graham's background, work habits, and development path through that connection. That does not guarantee anything regarding his future. It was specifically noted that Graham still has to prove himself, and there was no suggestion that a roster spot is already secured. Instead, this signing appears to be about creating another opportunity and allowing the player to compete through off-season activities, minicamp, and training camp. When you combine both developments, the Texans find themselves dealing with two very different stories at the same time. One story involves a significant loss, with CJ Stroud being ruled out for the season. The other involves a new opportunity, as Derek Graham enters the organization, looking to make an impression. One move forces Houston to search for answers at linebacker. The other adds another competitor to the offensive line room. The coming months will reveal how these situations ultimately impact the roster. But there is no question that the injury to Stroud stands as the biggest takeaway. A player who was expected to contribute this year is now facing a long recovery process, and the Texans must determine how to move forward without him. At the same time, younger players and newly acquired talent now have a chance to step into larger roles and prove they belong. Texans fans, what do you think about EJ? Stroud missing the entire 2026 season, and which player do you believe has the best chance to step up and fill the void at linebacker? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want the latest Houston Texans news first, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and click on the video on your screen right now. The fastest updates and biggest Texans stories, you'll find them right here.